Okay, hello everyone. So my name is Sara Hoem Iversen, and I work at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences, or Högskolan på Vestlandet, on campus Bergen. And I've actually been interested in children's nonfiction for a very long time because I wrote my PhD dissertation on the first children's dictionaries in Great Britain. But today, I'm very happy to have been given the opportunity to give an introductory lecture on research on non-fiction picture books, which is something I've worked more on in recent years. Um, and the title of this talk is Factual Magic, partly because I think that for many children, facts, whether they're about nature or technology or the body, can really be as wonderful and as fascinating as fiction. And partly because, well, magic, fiction, fictional texts, fairy tales, and imagination are also a natural part of children's worlds. And to give you a rough overview of the lecture, I'll start by discussing non-fiction picture books in general, with some examples, and address some of the debates surrounding terminology. I'll then present some of the strands of research within the field and go into some of the theoretical frameworks and typologies that have been developed to analyze non-fiction picture books specifically. And then I'll finish, or the second half of the talk, I'll present some examples of my own work on a particular subcategory of non-fiction picture books, namely picture dictionaries. So this is how I bring my previous interest in children's dictionaries into the 21st century, as it were, by looking at picture dictionaries. And I ask, can there be factual or fictional magic in dictionaries? Right. So although non-fiction picture books are a relatively recent field of research compared to, for example, children's fiction and fiction picture books, non-fiction and non-fiction picture books are far from new phenomena. The history of the first dictionaries and encyclopedias for children is also actually closely intertwined with the history of children's picture books. So what you see here is a page from the book Orbis Sensualium Pictus, or in English, The Visible World in Pictures. This is a picture encyclopedia for young children by the Czech educator John Amos Comenius, or Jan Amos Komensky, which you may have heard of. It was first published in Latin and German in 1658, and then in Latin and English the following year. Comenius believed that in texts for young children, words should be accompanied by images representing the objects they refer to. And in the preface to the first English edition, we can read Comenius's pedagogical thinking regarding the use of pictures. And I really like this quote, so I'll read it out to you. For the senses, being the main guides of childhood, evermore seek their own objects, and if they be away, they grow dull and writhe themselves hither and thither out of a weariness of themselves. But when their objects are present, they grow merry. This book, then, will do a good piece of service in taking especially flickering wits and preparing them for deeper studies. So when I read this, I can really almost see little children squirming with impatience because they've been given just a page of text with nothing interesting to look at, right? So it might seem like quite a simple idea that young children need visual support to maintain focus when reading and learning. But this really was a rather groundbreaking text, and it became incredibly popular and influential. And what you can see here on this page from the book are images of different animals and text stating what sounds they make. So the owl howleth, the frog croaketh, etc. And actually, this kind of topic and language level really wouldn't have been out of place in a present day picture book for young children, though, of course, very few 5-year-olds learn Latin today. So this book, Orbis Pictus, is often considered both the first children's encyclopedia and the first children's picture book. So that means that the very first children's picture book was a non-fiction picture book. And as the first and perhaps most famous non-fiction book for young children, Orbis Pictus has, as you may know, lent its name to the National Council of Teachers of English annual Children's Non-Fiction Award. And as you can read on the website for the Orbis Pictus Award, the NCTE Orbis Pictus Award for Outstanding Non-Fiction for Children was established in 1989 to promote and recognise excellence in the writing of non-fiction for children. And it commemorates the work of John Amos Comenius, considered to be the first book actually planned for children. Right? So you probably already have an idea of what non-fiction is and what non-fiction picture books might be, especially if you follow the lecture series on picture books so far. What do we expect from non-fiction as opposed to fiction? Now, the 4 book covers you see here all belong to different non-fiction picture books. And already from the paratext, or the cover in this case, you'll be able to see perhaps that these are very different texts on very different topics. So let's open the books and look inside. We'll start with blue. The first double spread in blue is strikingly, well, blue. The visual text is really what catches your attention first, though there are a few lines of verbal text which invite the reader to reflect and wonder. The colour blue is all around us. Have you ever wondered where it comes from? And then the next few lines are reminiscent of riddles. It's in the sky, but you can't touch it. It's in the sea, but when you cup it, it disappears. And then the illustrations of the 3 children flying in this blue sky and a blue-clad figure standing in the water and cupping it with their hands support the verbal text, but also expand on it. And as you can perhaps already see from this example, the visual text is important in non-fiction picture books as in fiction picture books. And the visual and the verbal text are really more than the sum of their parts. So the relationship or interaction between images and words is what Kristin Hallberg has referred to as the context, and Lawrence Sipes as synergy. And perhaps you've already heard these terms in this lecture series previously. But this interplay then is as important in non-fiction as in fiction. And in each spread, or each double spread of this picture book, there are different colours that dominate. So blue, orange, green, yellow. And through these visual and verbal elements, the book explores the history and the cultural and socio-political significance of the colour blue, including, as we see in the second example, its links to indigo and transatlantic slavery. So quite a heavy topics in some ways. Our second example, So blue was a history of a color, while the Catman of Aleppo tells the story of a real life person. But this is not a famous historical figure, but rather Muhammad Allah al-Yalil, who offered food and a safe haven to Aleppo's abandoned cats in the middle of the Syrian civil war. The second double spread in the book is a note in Arabic and English from Allah addressed to the reader. And this epistolary element, so this letter, may be considered part of the book's paratext, so something surrounding the story before the start of the narrative. And it's a strong signal to the reader that this is based on a true story. And there's also a direct appeal here, a call for action in real life. You can help too, the letter states. And here I just wanted to show you a photograph of Allah who inspired this book. And you can perhaps see that it looks a lot like the cover illustration for the book. So this is a fictionalized narrative, but the reader is reminded that the protagonist is based on a real person and that the events are based on a true story. And this is our third example. You may already be familiar with wordless or silent picture books, such as The Arrival by Sean Tan, which is a wordless narrative picture book. This book, Avant Après, or Before After, is a wordless non-narrative picture book. It's in some ways reminiscent of early concept books for young children, but it specifically revolves around the topic of time or temporal change. From left to right, on each spread, the tiny acorn becomes an enormous tree, the ice cube becomes a puddle of water, the birthday cake is eaten. The rocking horse and the rocking chair are a poignant juxtaposition encompassing the journey from childhood to old age. And if you are interested in this particular book, you can read more about it in Giorgia Grilli's chapter on the artistic nonfiction picture book in the open access publication Visual and Verbal Strategies in Nonfiction Picture Books, and you'll see the link here. Children's nonfiction picture books can also be alternatives or supplements to school textbooks, for example, when it comes to sexuality and puberty education for children. Anna Fisker's Hvordan det å ha en kropp, or What is it like to have a body, is a Norwegian picture book about bodies. Scholar Joe Sutcliffe Sanders has described children's nonfiction as a literature of questions. And this is a phrase I think befitting Fisker's nonfiction books in general. She's published a series of nonfiction for children, and typically the titles are all formulated as questions. They're also aimed at children around the ages 3 to 6, often called the why age, a time in which the children's desire to understand themselves in relation to the rest of the world peaks. And this book addresses body and body diversity, as well as topics related to physical changes during puberty, bodily autonomy, and consent. And through the visual and verbal text, the picture book attempts to demystify bodies and celebrate body diversity. All humans have a body, the verbal text states, and all bodies are different. So we see also in the visual text that bodies of different shapes, sizes, ages skin color, and to an extent, differently abled bodies are depicted. And the drawings are cartoonish and humorous, more so than in the previous examples, perhaps, in Anna Fisker's very distinct style. Now, as these examples may already have demonstrated, non-fiction picture books for children are an incredibly heterogeneous category. And if we expand the category further to include all children's non-fiction, whether or not they are picture books, it becomes even more diverse. In fact, multimodal non-fiction for children could include really anything from factual information on the back of milk cartons to children's newspapers, apps, ABC books, and picture book biographies. And the categories listed here are based on Margaret Mallett's work on children's non-fiction. And you see that here, children's picture books and graphic novels are put together in one category. So, of course, there are overlaps between these categories, and they're not necessarily on the same level, meaning that you can, of course, find biographies for children that are illustrated, biographies that are picture books, or indeed biographies with hardly any pictures at all. You can find topic books that are also narrative nonfiction. And as perhaps we've already seen, you can really find nonfiction picture books on almost any topic imaginable. Nonfiction then is hard to neatly categorize into genres. It's also difficult to clearly label and define. How do we refer to these kinds of texts? So far, I've used nonfiction, but does a rose by any other name smell as sweet, to paraphrase Shakespeare, or are some terms better than others? In Norwegian and Swedish, we have the term sakprosa, which could be loosely translated as factual prose, and German has the related word Sachliteratur, but there is really no such helpful one-word term available in English. The terms we use do matter because of what they potentially exclude as much as what they include, perhaps, because defining something based on what it is not can be problematic. Non-fiction is not fiction. And this appears to set up a binary opposition between fiction and non-fiction, in which fiction is prioritized. Moreover, a binary distinction like this also seems to assume that fiction and non-fiction are opposites or discrete categories. And this is something that scholars have demonstrated is just not the case. Scholar Nicola von Meerwelt, for example, finds the term non-fiction unappealing, precisely because it's a negative term. And she also discusses hybrid forms, where it's difficult to say whether the book is fiction or non-fiction. She therefore prefers the term informational picture book. However, Bettina Kummerling-Maybauer, who gave a lecture previously in this series, and Jörg Maybauer note that the term informational picture book suggests that narrative picture books are not informative, which is not the case. So they therefore prefer the term descriptive picture book. It's also worth noting that non-fiction can be narrative. So a distinction between descriptive and narrative must be separate from a distinction between fictional and factual, and we'll get back to this in a bit. It's not easy then to distinguish nonfiction from fiction or factual text from fictional text. I still vividly remember Nicola von Merveld, the person in this photo, and her striking demonstration of this point at the International Conference for the European Network of Picture Book Research here in Bergen in 2019. She had brought along a curious prop called the fiction meter. She held up, I remember, a children's book and solemnly scanned the cover. The device was blinking in red, and she announced this book is 60% fiction. Then the next book was apparently 95% non-fiction. Of course, it turned out that the apparatus was not a fiction meter at all, as no such thing exists, but rather a window cleaner attached to a bicycle light. Determining whether a book is fact or fiction is not simply a matter of scanning it or even reading it. But part of von Merveld's point was that non-fiction and fiction are not binary categories. Rather, fictionality is more of a spectrum. So, although I agree with her that the term non-fiction is problematic in many ways, I recognize that it's still the most commonly used, and I will therefore use it as an overarching category throughout this lecture. But it's worth bearing in mind these issues and problems. But really, we shouldn't let these problems with terminology, demarcation, or definition stop us from exploring these texts. After all, as literature scholar Mara Gubar has observed, it's also very difficult, if not impossible, to define children's literature. But that shouldn't stop us from talking about it, using it, and researching it. In recent years, thankfully, many scholars have set aside these terminology troubles in order to work specifically on children's nonfiction and nonfiction or informational or descriptive or factual picture books. And here you can see some of the more recent substantial research outputs: one monograph, 3 anthologies, and a special issue in the journal Bookbird. And of course, there's also an increasing number of research articles and individual chapters on children's nonfiction that are published every year. But if you're interested in nonfiction picture books, I would say that 1 or 2 of these books that you see here might be a good starting point. If we try to find one general defining aspect of these kinds of picture books, nonfiction picture books, it is perhaps that they are at their core about knowledge, or about the construction, presentation, and organization of knowledge for children. To Jo Sutcliffe-Sanders, who I've already mentioned, children's nonfiction is a literature of questions. That's the title of his book, this book question mark here. So that means that nonfiction requires critical, collaborative engagement from young readers. Child readers are not imagined as passive recipients of information or collectors of facts, but are rather positioned as collaborative co-constructors of knowledge, meaning that children's nonfiction invites questioning, critical inquiry, and redefinition on the part of the reader. Now, this doesn't mean that nonfiction can't also invite aesthetic reading experiences, and some might say that critical questioning and aesthetic experiences go hand in hand. As Giorgia Grilli writes, The artistic non-fiction picture book is a hybrid form of literature which encourages children to think critically about the world. It does not provide final answers, but rather invites readers to question common knowledge, opening it up to doubt, dialogue, and revision. In other words, this kind of non-fiction works much in the same way that art, or at least good art, does. And I'll now show you some of the different strands of research that we find within the field of non-fiction for children before moving on to a discussion of some of the theoretical frameworks or models you can use or draw on to better understand this construction of knowledge. Okay, so please just note, first of all, that this overview is not meant to be exhaustive. There is much more research than this. And I also won't go into each of these different strands now, but I just want to give you a sense of what is out there. There are these theoretical debates, there is research on the pedagogical context, on reader response, the use of nonfiction in literacy learning. There's research on the artistic and aesthetic aspects, as we've seen. There is a strand of research on nature and the environment, for example, eco-critical readings of nonfiction. And there's also a strand that looks at diversity and representation, such as representations of disability, gender, race, sexuality, and minority groups in children's nonfiction picture books. So perhaps you're already interested in some of these topics, but you haven't considered them in relation to nonfiction. Then you might want to look up some of these references. And in fact, I would say that research on children's nonfiction is almost as diverse as the books themselves, and that's a good thing. Okay, so as I said, I will now move on to a discussion of some of the theoretical frameworks and concepts that may help us better understand nonfiction picture books. And then I will apply some of these to my own work on picture dictionaries. Smiljana Narancic-Kovac tackles issues related to terminology that we've already discussed by proposing a separate typology or system of classification for nonfiction picture books. And here, importantly, she distinguishes between non-narrative and narrative nonfiction picture books. And in presenting this particular model, Narancic-Kovac moves away from this tendency to conflate nonfiction with non-narrative texts and fiction with narrative texts. And instead, she operates with, in a sense, 4 different categories: narrative and non-narrative text on the one hand, and fiction versus non-fiction on the other. So according to this model, it's possible for nonfiction and nonfiction picture books to be narrative or non-narrative. And this also opens up for more ways of examining hybrid text in which the boundaries between fact and fiction and narrative and non-narrative are more flexible. And I will talk a bit about an example. So the Swedish scholar Anna Backman notes that contemporary non-fiction picture books for children are often fictionalized. Their purpose, she writes, is to inform and teach, and at the same time entertain and elicit effective responses, so emotional responses. So to take an example, one of the books you see here, There is a series of books that are very popular and much adapted from the American publisher Scholastic, the Magic School Bus series. And these are good examples of narrative nonfiction. These books present scientific facts on various topics, like hurricanes or the body or the planets, but they approach this via the framing narrative of the Magic School Bus. So a class of children and their teacher board an anthropomorphic magical bus which takes them on school excursions that would be impossible in real life. Of course, a magical bus is also impossible in real life. The children then are able to visit the ocean floor in one book. They're caught inside a hurricane, as in this book you see here. They even travel back in time to the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods to learn about dinosaurs. So these books are quite literally examples of factual magic in the sense that magic is an element in the stories. The magical school bus becomes a device that allows the child characters, and through them, the child reader, to personally experience the different scientific phenomena each book is devoted to. So they're able to travel to the center of the earth, explore the inside of the human body, and so on. And in this way, children are positioned as scientists and explorers rather than simply recipients or collectors of information and knowledge. Another scholar, Patricia Larkin-Liefers, discusses implied readers and images of childhood in informational picture books, as she calls them, for children. And she uses the Magic School Bus inside a hurricane as one of her example texts. According to her analysis, this book depicts learning in a formal setting. So it's a formal school-directed activity, but at the same time, it's fun and the children have some agency in their learning. In this sense, she concludes, they are co-constructors of meaning and knowledge. And these ideas about the co-construction of knowledge are important in the next theoretical model that I'll present here. Literary scholar Nina Goga outlines three main approaches to organizing knowledge in children's nonfiction. They are the linear approach, the taxonomic approach, also called the spatial approach, and the circular approach. The linear approach adopts an accumulative and chronological view of knowledge. An example would be of this way of organizing knowledge would be the linear narrative. And in this approach, the child reader can be positioned, for example, as a collector of knowledge. Then in the taxonomic or spatial approach, knowledge is organized systematically, for example, through models, categories, and taxonomies. And in this approach, explanation and description are the predominant forms of presenting knowledge, and the child reader can be seen as an organizer of facts. Then finally, the circular or organic approach is more process-oriented and non-hierarchical. It's characterized by interrogative and discursive ways of presenting knowledge. And you might recognize now the way of thinking that was reflected in what Giorgia really said about artistic nonfiction and what Sanders said about the literature of questions. In this last approach, the reader can be positioned as a connector and co-creator of knowledge. Now, Goga stresses that this analytical toolbox, if you want to call it that, shouldn't be considered exhaustive and it shouldn't be used schematically. It's worth bearing in mind that most children's non-fiction picture books will probably combine some or most of these approaches. So the main purpose of these kinds of toolboxes is for researchers or teachers to map out the most prevalent approaches in their chosen material. But these approaches can also be applied, I've noticed, to children's picture dictionaries. So I'll now move on to a discussion of some of the ways in which I've applied these and other analytical approaches to categorize and understand what I see as a much neglected subcategory of nonfiction picture books. You might already have certain expectations of what dictionaries are and what they should do. Typically, dictionaries are expected to present knowledge about language and the world, and this knowledge can be organized in different ways. The list of headwords in a dictionary, so the entry words that are included, can be organized, for example, alphabetically, thematically, or both. In an alphabetically organized picture dictionary, isolated illustrations often accompany headwords, like in the example from the Oxford Very First Dictionary shown here. Scholars Günter Kress and Theo van Leuven, who are known for their research on semiotics and multimodality, note that the absence of a setting or background in the picture lowers its truth value. And these kinds of decontextualized objects become generic, typical examples or prototypical representations. But in thematic picture dictionaries, words are often organized according to conceptual domains and presented in the context of a setting, or what Kummerling, Maybauer, and Maybauer refer to as a script, such as here the dinner table tableau in the Oxford Children's Picture Dictionary. The Star Children's Picture Dictionary is organized according to semantic categories like food, drinks, and other things to eat, but then the entries within each category are organized alphabetically. And finally, a rather special example from my historical corpus, Francis Wilby's dictionary from 1844, which was aimed at children in infant schools, typically children below or just above school age, actually organized its entries according to rhyme. Hat, fat, sit, hit, bit, and so on. So that's quite a unique example. An example of different approaches to the organization of knowledge is the presentation of the colors in two different picture dictionaries. I just want to show you how different they are. In the Oxford Very First Dictionary, the colors are visually represented as isolated paint tubes spilling out on a white background. And this iconic representation is perhaps what Gorga might have referred to as a more taxonomic approach. By contrast, in the Longman Picture Dictionary, colors are represented in the context of a tableau showing fantastical underwater creatures. And this then is a more circular, organic approach to presenting and organizing knowledge. The readers must work harder to make the connections between the words and the image. Admittedly, they can be assisted by the little splashes of color in the word list, which again recall a more taxonomic approach. So here there is a combination. Children's literature scholar Barbara Bader referred to the drama of the turning of the page in the context of picture book. And this is an observation that is much cited within the field. You may have heard this quote before. A great deal of scholarly attention has been devoted to the drama of fictional picture books. Though, as you may have gathered by now, there is an increasing recognition that non-fiction picture books can also be narrative, artistic, and aesthetically engaging. But picture dictionaries are still mostly seen as a more traditional and less exciting subgenre of picture books, the main aim of which is to support literacy learning. We typically, for example, assume that dictionaries are not read from cover to cover, but rather consulted in a functional way to find the meaning or spelling of a word. So there is not really much drama to be had. But in contrast to this assumption, the preface of the Dictionary of Difficult Words informs the reader that there is no right way to read this book. It then goes on to suggest approaches such as reading it straight through from A to Z, reading out loud with loved ones, reading it in the dark with a torch, or looking up random pages with closed eyes. This challenges the assumption that picture dictionaries must present information in standardized traditional and taxonomic ways. And in fact, pictorial dictionaries with narrative scripts, such as the Oxford First Illustrated Dictionary here, challenges readers to find connections between the narrative scripts and the verbal definitions. If you look closely at the illustration here of the dragon and the princess and Pinocchio, you can actually find many of the words that are defined verbally in the text. So, for example, bow, branch, box, brave, the princess is brave, and boy, and many, many more. So some picture dictionaries, to a greater extent, invite readers to be co-constructors of knowledge, and that perhaps means more potential for the drama of discovery. Some dictionaries even explicitly position readers as scientists and explorers on exciting linguistic journeys. Your year of discovery is about to begin, the preface in the calendar dictionary, Collins' A Word a Day, announces. Although dictionaries are considered factual or informational texts, there are many ways in which picture dictionaries blur the boundaries between fact and fiction, or between reality and the fantastical. One way in which this happens is a feature that children's picture dictionaries share with children's picture books. The frequent use of anthropomorphic animals and toys, such as the tiger magician here in Britannica's Word of the Day, and the lions having breakfast in the Longman Children's Picture Dictionary. Picture dictionaries can also contain narratives or verbal stories. So this Britannica's Word of the Day book has a story of the month, which is a short, humorous narrative text featuring the words that represented that month. In a previous lecture in this series, Bettina Kummerling-Maybauer discussed intertextuality and interpictoriality in picture books. Intertextual and interpictorial references can also be found in non-fiction picture books, of course, including picture dictionaries. And references to fiction or fictional texts can be intertextual, often realized in the visual text, such as the depiction of Little Red Riding Hood in this page from the Oxford First Illustrated Dictionary. It's worth noting, though, that Red Riding Hood here looks like a child dressed up to participate in a school play. We also see the stage curtain here. So again, that situates the illustration in real life. But literary references are also sometimes used to verbally contextualize words, such as the entry on this same spread, which has the example sentence, Michael, John, and Wendy have many adventures with Peter Pan in Neverland. And Britannica's word of the day includes many words explained with reference to fiction, such as tomfoolery, contextualized by a quote from Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables. And some dictionaries, like Collins' A Word a Day, include entry words from literary texts, such as Jabberwock, defined as the fictional monster in Lewis Carroll's poem Jabberwocky. And we see that the illustration of the Jabberwock looks a lot like the typical illustrations of dragons that you see in children's books. Various ways of organizing knowledge in picture dictionaries also invite different interplay between fictional and factual elements. Whether something is presented as true or factual or as fictional and make-believe is not always clear or unambiguous. For example, in the Longman Children's Picture Dictionary, the tableau fairy tale ball illustrates vocabulary related to the semantic field of fairy tales, such as giant, witch, and fairy, which means, in a sense, that the makers of the dictionary thought that it was important that children learn these words in English as well. In many alphabetical picture dictionaries, isolated illustrations accompany each head word, and that also means that everyday words like fish and feather can be juxtaposed with words from the realm of fiction, like fairy. Although these words appear on the same page, they are separated by borders. By contrast, in the Oxford First Illustrated Dictionary, the fictional bleeds into the factual in the illustration. We see here the fairy sitting on the feathers, or the fairies are hiding in the feathers, as the caption in the bilingual edition of this dictionary states. Now, take a look at this double spread from the Oxford First Illustrated Dictionary for a way of further stating intertextual references to fiction in picture dictionaries. One of the entries here in the verbal text is dish. And in the visual script, we see a dish and a spoon holding hands, a reference to the dish ran away with the spoon from the nursery rhyme that you might know. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. The little dog laughed to see such fun, and the dish ran away with the spoon. And if you're an observant reader, child or not, you might find visual illustrations for other head words as well in this narrative script. For example, there are 3 dogs, including a Dalmatian. There's a doctor in disguise. There is a donkey jumping over the moon instead of the cow. And there is a doll in a blue dress. On a more abstract level, the tableau might also illustrate, words such as discover, as the group appears to be headed on a journey. So this language stimulating tableau is strengthened by the intertextual references to children's fiction and nursery rhymes, and this allows the characters, in a sense, to coexist in the same scene. In linguistics, the term modality refers to the credibility or truth value of a statement. Grammatical modality markers include modal verbs such as may, will, must, but modality can be expressed in a range of different ways, both linguistically and visually. Literary scholars Maria Nikolaeva and Carol Scott have built on the concept of modality and applied it specifically to picture books. They stress that complex modality comes from the interaction of the visual and verbal, which allow readers to decide whether to apply a mimetic or literal or a symbolic interpretation of the picture book. Pictorial dictionaries might sometimes show what Nikolaeva and Scott refer to as dubitative modality, that is, expressing a doubt in the verbal text, in the visual text, or both. I'll show you what I mean. An example of dubitative modality in the verbal text is the entry for magic in the Oxford First Illustrated Dictionary. It offers two separate senses of magic. One, in stories, people use magic to do impossible things. And two, magic is also doing clever tricks that seem to be impossible. Notice the word impossible in both definitions. The magic is either fictional or a trick. There is no third option. Picture dictionary entries for words belonging to the realm of the fantastic, such as magic, may present what Nikolaeva and Scott refer to as a counterpoint in modality, meaning that the verbal text presents something as true, while the visual text suggests a non-mimetic or non-literal representation, or the other way around. And this can be true even for alphabetically organized dictionaries with isolated entries. So, for example, the verbal definition of magic in the Oxford Reading Tree Dictionary states, magic makes impossible things happen. Here there is no mention of stories, but the illustration shows a dove emerging from a magician's top hat. And in this sense, it is the visual text that expresses the dubitative modality, even as the verbal text expresses indicative modality, saying that it's true, and the visual text shows it's not true. It's a magician performing a trick. And similarly, the verbal definition of witch in the same dictionary presents indicative modality through the categorical statement, a witch can do magic. But if we look at the illustration carefully, we see that it shows a child dressed up as a witch, and this subverts the credibility of the statement. Comparing this then to the illustration of fairy in the Oxford Very First Dictionary, we see that the visual image does show a fairy rather than the child dressed up as a fairy, perhaps. But the verbal text stresses that you can read about a fairy in stories. So, in other words, they are very much fictional. Humor and nonsense are important elements in picture dictionaries, as in many children's books. For example, if we look at the Longman Children's Picture Dictionary, there is a double spread devoted to the semantic field of fruit, but rather than presenting fruit in their context of trees or maybe someone eating fruit, they are presented in an absurd tableau called Fruit in the Gym, where the fruit are anthropomorphic creatures with googly eyes and limbs working out. In the Oxford Reading Tree Dictionary, the entry for vanish explains that if you vanish, you disappear. But then the illustration shows a boy literally vanishing, as if by magic, a concrete illustration of the verb. This element of humorous irony potentially empowers child readers who might delight in pointing out that someone who vanished would leave without being noticed, not literally become invisible. And if we look at the thematic calendar dictionary, an interesting word for every day of the year, we could say that, well, this dictionary is rooted in the realm of fiction because all of the recurring characters are anthropomorphic animals, and they often appear in everyday situations, creating what Julie Cross has referred to as humorous incongruity. For example, in Piggy's Pizza Parlor, we see a presumably cannibalistic pig chef serving pepperoni pizza to herbivore animals such as a cow and a deer. And these kinds of jarring juxtapositions require that the child reader either read these characters as human rather than animals, or that they embrace the humorous contradiction. And these really are cognitive leaps that children are already used to from fiction. These references to the Jabberwocky, dragons, unicorns, witches, fairies, and so on in children's dictionaries tap into children's knowledge of fiction and mythology and their interest in fantastic creatures. And of course, this too is part of the construction and negotiation of knowledge, but knowledge related to myths, fiction, and storytelling rather than, for example, scientific fact. The verbal definition of words for fictional and fantastical creatures in picture dictionaries might be given a lower truth value through the use of qualifying adjectives, adverbs, and so on. For example, in the Oxford First Illustrated Dictionary, a unicorn is defined as a creature in stories that looks like a white horse with a long horn in the middle of the forehead. And this definition clearly situates unicorns in the realm of the fictional. And a giant is defined as a huge person in fairy tales. This is accompanied by the illustrative example sentence, the giant chased Jack down the beanstalk. And the page that you see here where the entry appears is dominated by an imposing illustration of a giant looking down at the verbal entries in the dictionary. His hand grabs the beanstalk that winds its way across the double spread from the bottom of the verse page to the top of the recto page. And on the other end here is little Jack hanging on for dear life. There's certainly, I would say, narrative drama on this double spread, even if it's not the drama of the turning of the page. And other dictionaries use similar strategies. For example, the entry for mythical in the dictionary Collins, A Word a Day, explains that something that is mythical is imaginary or exists only in stories. In certain cases, though, the truth value in a verbal definition might be higher. For example, in a dictionary of difficult words, chimera is verbally defined as a fire-breathing monster with the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a snake. So there are no qualifying adverbials like in mythology or adjectives like fictional or mythological to suggest that chimeras are not real, but there is an implication perhaps that the readers will know this, which is supported by the accompanying drawing of a rather cute little chimera that you maybe see here. The verbal definition of the word cryptozoology on the same in the same dictionary defines it as the study of animals and creatures that many people think are imaginary. This formulation opens up for creative imagination by not firmly denying the existence of such creatures, with the assumption that most readers will be among those who think unicorns are imaginary. And in the larger spread devoted to the word, the visual text shows examples of mythological creatures not mentioned in the verbal text, like mermaids, dragons, fairies, and yeti. And this challenges the reader to be again a co-constructor of knowledge by finding and naming the different creatures. But the verbal text refutes the existence of unicorns with reference to a lack of scientific evidence. Unicorns are assigned to the realm of fiction. Well then, how can children's picture dictionaries, as texts that are both subcategory of nonfiction picture books and subcategories of dictionaries, define magic for child readers? Should they be strictly factual and consign magic to the realm of the fictional without further ado? Should they Encourage ambiguity through counterpoint and modality, and let the readers draw their own conclusions. The interplay between the visual and verbal and fact and fiction in picture dictionaries and in non-fiction picture books in general can be humorous and absurd. It can be an invitation to a playful perspective on meaning making, where boundaries between the everyday and the magical are flexible. After all, as I suggested at the start of this talk, the everyday can be magical, and magic can and is part of the everyday, at least for children. This is factual magic, illustrated by the entry bioluminescent in a dictionary of difficult words, which explains that, I quote, fireflies are bioluminescent, and this helps them find and recognize one another. Different types of fireflies flash in different patterns and colors. Well, to a child, or indeed adult, fireflies communicating with colored lights can be as magical as any fairy or unicorn. Right. Thank you very much for your attention.